Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Anstey and WSP webinar today, Post-Pandemic Predictions for the Residential Property Sector. I'd like to first introduce you to the panel speaking today. Firstly, we have Chris Pritchett. He heads up the energy team at Anstey. He's recognised as one of the most innovative and creative lawyers in the business. Chris was named in 2019's The Lawyer Hot 100. His ambition lies in finding new opportunities in emerging technologies, helping to create hybrid energy and data projects that put the customer first. Next, we have David Simons. He is WSP's Future Ready Innovation Lead. Future Ready is WSP's flagship innovation and sustainability program, seeing the future more clearly and working with clients to this future as well as today's needs and codes. David is an internationally respected consultant. He is the 2020 Environmental Professional of the Year for the Society for the Environment and was BusinessGreen.com's Leader of the Year. We welcome Megan Carter. She is the Senior Regeneration Manager for Portsmouth City Council and is Programme Manager of the Tipner West Regeneration. Megan has a strong background in programme management in local authorities and can offer some real-life examples of how COVID-19 has impacted the Tipner scheme. We look forward to hearing about those. And myself, I am a legal director at the Southampton office of Anstey. I act for developers and landowners in the acquisition of residential development sites. I also work on commercial development projects and carry out work for tenants of commercial premises. So that's us here today. So the structure of the meeting. Today, we hope to cover some topics for our sector that were considered hot topics pre-COVID, and we'll consider now how, if at all, we think things have changed in the marketplace, whether or not as a result of the pandemic. The topics that we're going to cover today are urbanisation, sustainability, infrastructure, and the planning system. Now we recognise that this disease is set to last for a while in our communities, and we have to ask ourselves, do we need to reconsider our priorities in the industry? And what will we be talking about in 5 years' time about the state of the marketplace? As we work through the topics, please feel free to raise questions using the Q&A facility, and we will endeavour to answer them as we go. The questions are, thankfully, anonymous. If we don't get to your answers today, we will aim to pick them up at a later date and get back to you. We'll also be running some polls for some added insight if you would like to take part. During the last census in 2011, London's population was 8.8 million, but now currently sits just under the UN megacity threshold at a little over 9 million. UN figures estimate that the percentage of UK's population residing in urban areas is currently at 83.9%. In 2030, this is predicted to reach 86.3%, and by 2015, an astronomical 90.2% of our population will be living in urban areas. So with that in mind, we'll turn to the first poll of the webinar. If you could get your fingers at the ready, the answer is yes or no. Pre-COVID research, let me just do it. Start polling. There we are. Pre-COVID research expected by 2025, there to be an extra 2.5 million people in the UK city centre. The question is a yes or no answer. Is this trend set to continue? So whilst you have a think about that and exercise your fingers, I'll hand you over to David, who can pick up the topic with the results. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicola, and very good morning to those of you who've joined the call. Good afternoon for those of you if you're in Europe. So yes, I mean, unsurprisingly, the results from this is the vast majority of you, just over 2/3, think that no, this trend is not likely to continue, which I suppose is kind of obvious, really. I suppose just from our personal experience. In WSP, we've been tracking I think three main areas of trends from COVID. So first of all, a trend we'll think that social distancing is likely to continue for some time, just simply because the virus isn't likely to be going anywhere. And so at least for the foreseeable future, that keeping 1 meter apart, face masks, caution, etc., is likely to be with us, and that has profound impact on how we live, how you live as well, and also what people think about the developments that we're doing. But I think there's also two other main areas that that are trends that we're tracking. So secondly, in addition, this crisis, this virus, has put rocket burners under trends that we were seeing already. So if you just think about what trends we're seeing already, the decline of the high street, the move to more remote working, the use of video technology. These were all trends that we were inching through, and all of us, and you can see that for your offices as well, we're thinking about working differently, and living differently as well. So we just see that what COVID has done is really accelerated those trends, and I'll come and talk a little bit about maybe some of those in a minute. The third area, though, is that what COVID has done is it has just allowed us all to ask and dare to ask the sort of questions that we would never dare to be asking before, and to be asking really fundamental questions about why are we doing things like this. And historically, the answer might have been because we have always done that, or the answer might have been just because, well, that's what we expect. Now COVID means that we are being able to ask braver questions. And if I just give you one example of that, a local authority that I've been working with had a program, a Smarter Ways of Working program. And you know what? Pretty much every red line that they had set out, this is why we cannot do this, has now been completely bust, not least of which pretty much every member of staff is working from home, and that changes how we live, and that changes the nature and what we want from our developments. Some of that is around urbanisation, of course, which you can see that trend has accelerated, and you can see that from resi developments as well. So you'll see, for example, that Redrow announced last week that it was taking a step out of London and was focusing more on its more regional and what it called its more traditional developments, more green space, and the like. And also, I think we've seen from a number of our clients that developing greenfield sites outside London is seen as less risky. You can take a development site in a greenfield place, or indeed in a brownfield space, and you can split it into 4 or 5 plots. That's something you can't do with a 20-story urban development if you're building flats. So it's just a simple way to address that. And then maybe the other area that I'll just touch on as well is just one of the trends that we've been identifying and had been tracking really for maybe 2 or 3 years, quite unusually for an engineering and design practice, is just one around social isolation and loneliness. And with lockdown over the past months, that's just been a really interesting area. It's brought it into focus, and also it's really shown the opportunity for both from a master plan development and also just from a community perspective, how important communities and ways of working are. So with that in mind, let me just ask you, this is my favorite question that I ask for everybody. There's a poll that I've just opened which says, how many names of neighbours do you know? So don't overthink this, because you can spend a long time working out the numbers on this. But this is quite a good talisman for community, and both it highlights to our minds both some of the challenges, but also some of the opportunities if we're all working from home and we're living much more at home. So I'll just, as the results come in, it's quite interesting that a third of you on the call know the names of between none and 3 people. Then most of you, the balance, know the names of between 4 and 10, and just about a quarter know more than 11 people. I would say on that basis, you're probably a more sociable group. What our research has shown that on average, most people know in the UK the names of between 1 and 3 people. Very, very few people know the names of more than 15 people. And quite interesting for urban living as well. From our research, the people who live in flats, most people, around about 2/3 of people who live in flats, know the names of not a single person who lives in their block. And that's just really amazing, isn't it? When you think about when you think about the importance of social isolation. Let me just ask you, if you give me some forbearance before I pass back, let me ask you one other question. Have you borrowed anything from a neighbour in the past year? And I think probably this will be a high one because you think you are a social audience. So yeah, I think you are a lively, sociable community group, and maybe actually we'll see these numbers are higher because of lockdown, because we're spending more time in the community.
The next question is, have you given it back?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I think I've ticked a high number on the number of neighbours' names I know, because they've probably been large volumes of them complaining about the noise my kids make during lockdown. So
kids are quite a good way for building community. Yeah, maybe in the right way, Chris. Maybe not necessarily all for the right reason.
It's very charitable. Thanks.
Over half of you have borrowed something from a neighbour, 58%. That's pretty interesting. So I'll be quiet there, but just apart from to note that from a community and social isolation piece, we see that becomes incredibly important in developing new master plans and in building those right in from the start. And we will see that becomes much more important after COVID. And what's really interesting from Future Ready with our WSP research is that's the preserve of the master planner and the engineer as much as the NGO, as much as the local authority, and much as community. We don't have the nirvanic answer, but there is a huge amount that we can do. That's I think probably one of our key outcomes and key learnings from COVID that has really accelerated.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Dave, can I pick up, I guess, on one aspect of that? And I really like this sense of looking for community by design, and that may be becoming far more important post-COVID. One of the things I was reading about that's happening in the US a great deal at the moment is looking at the urbanization trends and actually trying to anticipate what the impact will be post-pandemic, and actually going as far back as Spanish flu and even further back beyond that to plague, and saying, well, what is actually going to happen? And what seems to be the thinking here is that, as we might anticipate, there's a bit of a flight to green spaces. So in American cities, flight to the suburbs, so suburbanization, or flight to rural areas. But working against that, actually, people who have been isolated and have been looking for opportunities coming back into the cities, and predominantly younger people. So they have this horrible, horrible phrase which Bloomberg were using called youthification, which I suggest we never use again. But it's this sense of actually of people saying, well, will cities become a little bit more affordable? Will younger people be prepared to take more of the risk of infection or risk of living conditions in order to have more social interaction, better economic opportunities, and more facilities to partake of? So you've got those two factors working against each other, and what you're then getting is a younger city. And historic research, and I know times have moved on a lot, but since Spanish flu, cities became younger very, very quickly, and even going sort of far back to sort of plague times, the youth were prepared to take the risk because the opportunities were there and the social interaction were there, and the older people with families were then moving to suburbs or to rural areas. And I guess, Megan, do you feel that's something that we might see in the UK? And David, again, get your reflections on whether the sort of the US view might crystallize.
I do. Yeah, I think it's an interesting theory, sort of, that the younger people will move into the cities, and I think as you say, history tells us that that is actually probably the way forward that will happen. But I think it's interesting that I think we might see people living in different types of communities. So picking up on your point, David, when you were saying about social isolation and tackling that sort of loneliness and isolation, I think it's interesting how you stay socially isolated within a community. And I think that's going to be something that it's really easy to say, oh, we're going to do a master plan that's, tackling loneliness and isolation. But when, you've got papers being published by the UN saying that this will happen again, how do we make sure that people feel that they are within that community? So I think what we might find is quite communities that could potentially disconnect themselves. And I think when we're looking at sort of what's been happening over the last few months, the NHS clap was people were craving that sense of community, but obviously they couldn't interact, and you've seen a real boom in local businesses being supported. So people are supporting their local. So I think you will see those communities that can disconnect. But I also think we might become a little bit less obsessed with London and the sort of bigger cities. I think you might see, the cities, particularly for us example, along the South Coast, if you're only going into London a couple of days a week, Portsmouth and Southampton and the New Forest have become a really, really viable option for you. And if you've been living away from family because the opportunities have been in the bigger cities, or if you've just been having to commute in and people want to be able to live and work where they are, well, now you can do that because you'll be working at home 3 days a week and you've only got to get into London sort of 2 of those days. So I think we're about to see quite an interesting expansion of that London commuter belt, and people realizing that actually opportunities can be all across, there's regional. And I think, if you look at the British economy, I think it'd be interesting to see where we see an influx of people going to try and change the way they live for their isolation or for their mental health. It'll be really interesting to see.
Can I just pick up something on that? It's a really interesting conversation now. There's a UK Gov poll that has done some calculations on the numbers of people working at home in the UK during the COVID. There was 52% of adult working population working from home, which ordinarily pre-COVID was 5%. So that's a huge increase, and a possible, even if there is a new normal coming back, what will that normal be? It won't shrink back to 5%. So, social isolation and working from home, it's, we were looking at isolation from an older person perspective, weren't we? Very much so pre-COVID. But now, London was catering for the young in the build-to-rent schemes and the more social environments there. I mean, is that going to be something that we're going to have to look at and readdress now?
I think, Nicola, the concept of the lonely person being the old person, I think research after research has shown that actually the people who are most likely to be social isolated are the young. They're disabled people, they're ethnic minorities, they're people with mental disabilities, and those cohorts are far more likely to suffer from social isolation and loneliness than older people. I think that the other area just to pick up on that is when we are designing master plans and the like, again, there is quite a lot of evidence that the design has a huge impact on that. And just 2 examples of that is one, the number of names of neighbours that people know is generally directly correlated to the traffic flow down their street. So that's why these opportunities to design in active travel, walking and cycling, you are much more likely to meet neighbours and talk to people if you're active travelling than if you're hopping in your car and travelling. The same also to get that balance between green space in front of your house, but also the opportunity to have some privacy as well. And rather interestingly, generally a 10.6 foot front garden is generally regarded by academics as the optimum front garden to give you that privacy and also that opportunity to wave to your neighbours while you're out the front as well.
Yeah. I suppose I'm interested as well, just, and I was thinking, I suppose, and some of the papers were thinking about addressing isolation in particularly younger people by this flight towards the city areas. But David, you also, your research at the beginning was saying that you could live in a large block of flats in the city and actually potentially be less likely to know lots of your neighbours. And I also completely understand when you've got a bit more space and you can engineer, abilities to create community by meeting neighbours and walking around and that sort of thing. How do we do it in the urban sense? And maybe as people do work from home, maybe office blocks are being repurposed into some form of PRS scheme or affordable housing.
Yeah.
How do we make those A, sort of attractive to people, and B, how do we sort of try and make those into communities as well, which I think is perhaps more of a design challenge. And Megan, I think that's probably something that you will have some thoughts on too.
Yeah, I'll let David go first because I lost you a little bit. But go on, David, if you pick up on that, and then I'll come in with some of the stuff we felt real life for Tipner.
I think a couple of points on that is if you just convert an office building to rows of flats, you run a real risk where you get very dense living. But exactly as you say, you run the risk of not knowing anybody down your corridor. When you get in the lift, you won't know anybody, and so you don't get your community. What you want to design is small pockets where you have lots of small interactions with a small number of people, rather than lots of interactions with lots of people where you don't get to know people. So very often it's splitting corridors up. So you've got groups of 3 or 4 houses, 3 or 4 flats where you can get to know people.
Yeah,
I think they're just, on the same level though. Also, is let's also not get too utopic on this as well. The reason that people live in flats, the reason that master plans historically have been developed the way they have been, is just from a viability and an affordability perspective as well.
Sure.
So I think there is also a real interest that for development to also have a degree of honesty in this as well. That we all would want for our developments these wonderful things. There is tons that we can do that does not increase the cost and makes them better places to live, to create more communities. But there are other decisions where frankly we could do it, but it would just make them a whole lot more expensive to do, and so that would just make those developments really challenging, particularly if we're about to enter a recession.
Indeed. Well, all those office blocks have got loads and loads of perspex screens in them now, so we could just keep those, and then you'd know everybody. Megan, I guess so I guess that's something you have considered in Tipner as well, as to whether you've got some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think the first thing that we started off telling everyone was you can't build a community, something that obviously has to organically grow. And it's not talking about the buildings and the surroundings, it's talking about the people that are going to live there and what do those people need and people want. And you can't sort of enforce this utopian sort of, oh, we're all going to live in this wonderful community. I think it's something that you have to obviously consider through design. I think it is something that people really say. And actually the viability of these schemes sometimes means that those really good bits that actually COVID's now said, no, you have to do this. I think the viability and the way we approach development, that has stopped us, and we've taken out the sort of nice to do's, whereas actually these are now need to do's in developments. And I think it's about understanding sort of what the vibe, what's the ethos of these places, what is it that you're providing, is there enough to do and enough to keep people engaged and enough to keep people wanting to be a part of that community. And I think it's interesting, having front gardens but don't have fences. There's things you can do to sort of that really help community to organically grow. But I think we get really hung up on talking about building a community, and you can't. It is something that you have to put as much thought but it is something that can organically grow.
Yeah. I'm quite interested in the open front gardens. That seems to me to be something that was very popular perhaps in the 50s and 60s, and then there's been quite a trend of those gardens being paved over to make car parking spaces as parking has become more difficult. And but it's quite easy to see that something like that would definitely create that sense of engagement with people over the road or next door.
Yes, or providing common facilities as well. So there's sorry, Nicola, there was again some really interesting research from Vancouver on just creating some, in that case, some common volleyball courts, and understanding who it was who used those, and generally actually that was the proximity and the feeling of ownership of those courts, rather than necessarily whether it was part of a development or not. So again, lots of opportunities for slightly more imaginative thinking in that.
Yeah, sure. I suppose I'd like to as well pick up on the point you raised, David, about active travel. And I guess one of the one of the real pandemic headlines was this reduction in air quality, reduction in emissions from transport. And I guess my sense is, and I think the research is already showing, we're on the way to a bit of a bounce back of that, particularly as people are more reluctant to use forms of mass transit. So buses and trains and what have you. And I think there's a real, for me, there's a sort of sweet spot in the middle where everyone goes, well, we can make the cars electric, and that's good, and we can all get behind there. But I suppose when you're developing a scheme, or you're considering a scheme, or you're writing a master plan, to what extent are we going to be approaching development and saying, what is it that our customers or our inhabitants or our users are going to want? And to what extent are we going to approach this by what are the planners telling us we have to do? And I suppose I'm finding, I mean, the answer might well be both, but I'm very interested, I think, to hear your thoughts on that, as to whether this is something we are going to see genuinely consumer-led, or is it something that really has to be imposed from the top down?
Yeah. I think it's interesting because obviously Tipner West is looking at a car-free environment. So we were really strongly moving towards having, less dependency on cars, increasing people's mobility through walking, cycling, scooters, or sort of, electric pods that travel to where people need to be. And we've also got the luxury of having the water, so traveling through the water, but it's thinking differently about how people want to get about. And little things like when I took out car free to the schools, the kids had no problem with that. That was really comfortable to them. Their climate is their priority, and is the thing that they are really keen to sort of save. And it's been interesting in Portsmouth, we're now starting to look like the Bahamas. The water is so blue. We've seen such a change in that small amount of human involvement. It's beautiful out there, and we've seen a real interest in that. As a community, Portsmouth's done very little now to become a really, the sea looks a bit amazing, but I think it is about increasing people's ability to move and not car dependency. And obviously there's going to be less on public transport, but I think we can do that, by widening pathways, putting some, spending into getting these cycleways and walking ways. And that's really, people assume that everyone can walk and cycle. They can't. There's got to be, it's about mobility for individuals. So I think really putting the thought and getting that right straight away, and how that connects up. It's okay sort of enhancing one strip, but actually if that doesn't connect through to another piece of walking way, or that is just as good a quality, then you're blocking people off. I personally don't think people are going to go all back to vehicles or all back to using public transport. I think people are going to move less. So actually the odd time they do use public transport, the odd time they do use a car, obviously there'll be less usage. But I think people are going to be able to get about on their own without having to use public transport. And particularly as the younger generations come through, climate's their number one priority. So they're not going to be jumping back into cars. It is sort of the sense I get. But happy to, any thoughts on that, David?
Yeah, I think your point on people travelling less is absolutely a trend. So generally, each of us as individuals is travelling, apart from our international holidays, we're travelling about 10% less than we were 15 years ago, even before COVID. We're travelling less to go to work. We're traveling less to go shopping, and maybe because we're a bit more mean-spirited, we're traveling less to see friends and relatives. We're spending more. We're traveling more on leisure at the moment, which is potentially nice for and good for Portsmouth and the waterfront down in Southampton, Nicola, as well. But I think, I mean, just my overarcher sort of, I suppose, if you're thinking about master plan developments, is I think we will see this much faster coming into local plans. So we're working with a number of local authorities at the moment where climate emergency strategies, pretty much every local authority, if you just go to Hampshire, you could go Southampton, Portsmouth, Eastleigh, Basingstoke and Dean. All of these authorities have declared a climate emergency strategy. Hampshire has just launched its climate action plan. I think it's due to be heard by the council members meeting next week. there is a huge amount of action, and transport is round about, I think, 30% of UK greenhouse gas emissions, and they are emissions that frankly haven't changed significantly over the last 15 years. Electric vehicles will support that, but they are absolutely not the nirvanic answer to creating better places. If you want to create better places, and build back better, as the saying goes after COVID, it has to be around promoting active travel, walking, cycling. First trials of e-scooters just starting now. I'm really excited to see, in fairness, Department for Transport has a £250 million grant allocation that it's just given out to regional highways authorities to lock in active travel. Tranche 1 of that's just been allocated. Tranche 2 and Tranche 3 are out for bidding at the moment. I think this could really be the chance to change something. But in contrast, what I will though say is you have to have a plan for it. You have to have a plan for as a developer for that. You have to have a plan as a highways authority. You also, from a workplace perspective, have to have a plan, because otherwise, naturally, just as humans, you row back to what's easiest, and already you can see traffic levels going up fast. That's great because the economy's growing as well. But let's use this as a chance not just to bounce back. So 12 months, we're back to the same poor air quality and the same levels of traffic that we had before.
Yeah. Sorry, from an infrastructure perspective, can the country deliver
on active travel or on?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I think it can do, because generally, in the nicest way, cycling and walking is not an expensive thing to deliver. Generally, the finance is not the barrier. Generally, the barrier is bravery of decision makers to actually make that, an appetite quite often from a highways authority perspective of council members who quite often are, dare I say it, slightly older and slightly more wedded to their cars.
Yep. I think I mean, as well as the climate issues, and well as also attacking things like congestion, because coming back to my suburbanisation discussion earlier on, one of the then fears is that actually congestion in suburban areas becomes much worse than it is already. But I think the other thing that we can pull back into this is this concept of community that can be built around things like bikes. It's potentially things like rental or pay-as-you-go e-bikes, and a rack of e-biking. And I think the e-bike's quite an interesting one in that it sort of more readily replaces a car than perhaps a bike does for some people. And I think that's an exciting opportunity. And I think it doesn't carry some of the risks and the regulatory uncertainty of an e-scooter, but people are getting on e-bikes more readily. And I think if there's a way in which that can be made more safe and more appealing, because a lot of people are keen to cycle but worried about the risks from other drivers and car users. So I think there's a real opportunity there. And then if you can then ally that with some form of you could build a development around a rack of e-bikes or a rack of car shares for EVs, perhaps walking routes connecting in, perhaps there's a coffee cart there as well, and suddenly you've got a little bit of a village centre in a way that, if everyone just simply gets in their car and drives off the driveway, you're not going to have. So I think it's an opportunity to kill a few birds with one stone potentially.
Yeah, and I'm sure, as Megan will talk about for Tipner as well, this is all about, remember that travel is only ever derived demand. You only travel because you need to do something. Nobody willingly, unless you want to do your exercise. So if you can create your community, your 15-minute walking communities, so that you've got your coffee shop there early on in a development. I mean, plenty of examples.
Or your farm shopping coffee, that sort of thing.
Exactly, but that gives you a hub, and you walk there rather than getting in your car to go to the supermarket. That's your opportunity to be thinking about differently. And Megan, that's exactly what Tipner is looking at its heart as well, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it's been interesting with Tipner. We had I've spent a lot of my time talking about how we get you out if you don't have a car. This is how we get you out. If you live here, and you have a disabled mother that lives in Southampton, you know, this is how we get you out to care for that person. And I had a gentleman that was paralysed from the waist down and said, if you get it right on Tipner, I don't need to leave. Stop assuming that I need to go. If you can get the infrastructure in Tipner, the community spaces, you know, get everything that you should have in a community, then stop assuming that I would therefore always need to leave. And I think there's a few points picking up from what you said. It's that that holistic overview of cycle paths and things like that. I think that's quite a challenge. Sometimes you, as I said earlier, you only correct a little bit, and walkways, and actually you need to look at that holistic approach, that customer journey through to wherever that destination is. Look at it as its entirety. Don't work in silos. Make sure that you're really understanding that route through and that holistic approach. And a little bit around you were saying, David, some of the biggest challenges. Obviously, I think cultural change is one of the biggest challenges, and picking up what you said at the start, there was a lot of, oh, we can't do that, you know, oh, I can't ride a bike. Well, now you can ride a scooter, you can walk now, you've been walking to your local bakery through COVID, you can walk here now. And I think part of that cultural change, everyone's assumed that they don't need to walk or cycle, whereas now actually we might see a bit of a cultural shift, and cultural change is obviously one of the biggest challenges, getting people to sort of think differently and think outside the box. So yeah, I think it's Tipner's been a really interesting example to talk through those 15-minute walkable communities and talk through some of those customer journeys of, you know, removals, things like that, and roads. Who's king on the road, and what does that feel like for the most lonely and vulnerable in our society? How do they come out onto a road and still feel safe? You know, we've done a lot to accommodate drop curbs, and we've done bollards here and there to try and keep people safe. But actually, we've made a lot of barriers for people to engage and to be within a community, and to feel safe in that community.
Absolutely. I suppose active travel is definitely like one aspect of heat when it comes to of emissions and as climate protection. I was picking up on the fact, David, that so many local authorities have declared a climate emergency, and they're going to have to be demonstrating that they're going about their activities with that in mind, or the likes of Client Earth will give them a good kicking. I suppose what are the other things that you're seeing and thinking about? And from our point of view, there's definitely a pretty rapid surge in interest on things like ESCOs, community heat, decarbonisation of district heat, certainly on microgrids and using sort of separate microgrids to develop your community around and enable, you know, more renewables on rooftops or batteries or whatever. And I guess from an energy point of view, I suppose I'm in a bit of a bubble, because I see that because it's happening. On those, it's happening too. But looking more broadly at the industry, and Nick, same question for you, is how much is this sort of starting to proliferate across the industry? And again, do we see this being something that's very much a target of local authority policy?
I mean, if I just give you some quick, I mean, I think, you know, I think new build is almost the easy piece. I think that, you know, absolutely, I think we will see local plans already. There's national government requirements that, for example, you can't build or won't be able to build new homes with gas heating after 2025, and you know, and day in, you know, every week almost there's an announcement. Barratt's tremendous announcement last week on their ambitions on zero carbon homes. And just, I mean, you know, remember of course that, you know, when we're developing projects today, you know, the UK economy has effectively to be a fossil-free economy in 30 years. So that's, you know, that within the development lifetime of projects goes incredibly quickly. I think the piece that probably is the bigger challenge is, how do you retrofit existing communities, and also what's the role of companies as well when we're all working from home as well. So quite looking forward to the statement tomorrow, trailed today, the Chancellor's announcement on a 2 billion scheme to drive home insulation. Really interesting. There'll always be snipers, but it's a great start.
It's you know, you can snipe about plenty of it, one of which is it's not as good as everyone else, but it is a heck of a change. And
exactly.
And actually, if they can target that appropriately to those potentially living in fuel poverty, that's a serious set of policies. But no, thanks very much. And I guess, and Nikki, Megan.
There's always a viability, affordability question to answer in all of this. I mean, it's great to give people the opportunity to live in large space, have their own space, their own private space. There's a great sort of concept. People have been looking. I think Rightmove said that they had double the number of people looking, probably because they're working from home and able to, but looking on their website at living accommodation in Portsmouth and Bournemouth, getting out of the city, wanting to have their front gardens, back gardens, and then we've got the sustainability argument coming in. Barrett's saying that to get net zero greenhouse emissions by 2040, we've got all these lovely concepts, but then there's who can afford the homes, and what's the viability, and that has to be really driven by the local authorities and government creating the schemes, releasing the money to enable these properties to be built in a sustainable fashion at an affordable price.
I agree totally, and it's these tick box design trends that people just say. They just say, oh, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and it's always the first things to be redacted and to be taken away because of viability. And as I said earlier, we're now in a point where we've got to do these things. These are going to be the right things to do. And I was on another webinar recently, and the Savills team was saying, everyone wants a garden, everyone wants internet. That's now an absolute no-go when it comes to buying a property. So looking at the infrastructure you're going to need to get people hooked up to 5G and super fast this and really fast that, it's going to be a really interesting sort of infrastructure. And I think as a local authority, it's a challenging role for all local authorities. We're expected to consult and engage on the here and now, but we've also got to predict and preempt everything for the future for our communities. And we're the ones that are left with the legacy, whether that's a good legacy or a negative legacy. Those local authorities can't step away from that. And it's about that responsible partnering with people that we understand the P&L of the big developers out there and all the private companies. But there's also a massive pressure on local authorities, and they have to understand what we need from these developments. Don't just take the profit and leave us with average developments. Come and build something with quality and not just tick these boxes. Let's actually start to talk about how we make this stuff viable, because it's the right thing to do. And future generations are going to question why we didn't do this sooner.
And that's a nice segue, Megan, for the last poll question, if you want to read it out.
Yes, I will. Okay, so the last poll question is, what do you see as the most desirable quality for customers in a new build house? So what are people valuing as they're now looking for new homes, or they're looking to move? What do you think they're going to value the most?
Oh,
okay, and I have to go to my little thing, don't I? There we go. Okay, so interesting. So polls coming back in, and 82% garden or green spaces, and it's absolutely it's interesting. I think that's exactly what people are going to do. But we've been really driving home, all of us have been community spaces, and we've been talking a lot about getting communities to interact. So when we say gardens, is that private? Is that space where you can socially isolate but be within a community? People have wanted to access nature. I think it's interesting. Green and blue spaces are so important. Look at the way the beaches, people have flocked to the seaside. The sea, we have an interesting relationship with the sea as human beings. It's a sense of discovery, a sense of peace, sense of tranquility. It's a really emotive thing. So people are wanting to find these natural spaces, but they also need to have them in their own backyard. And I think that's going to be a challenge for developers going forward, and the amount of green open space, and looking at local plans and looking at their open space requirements. It's going to be a really interesting conversation over the next few years to really establish what does proper green open space look like. There's a real sense that the younger generation are going to want to just live in big communities and not have their own space, whereas now we really do need that.
Yeah. And I guess it's a question, it's like you say, it all goes to viability and who's going to pay for it. But I can see there's an open spaces management discussion, who pays for it, and people people contribute to the management of that. And it could be the same with your sort of active travel community area, if you like. And are people prepared to take a degree of ownership and financial responsibility for those community assets, or is that something they're going to be looking either to the private sector or to local government or to the developers themselves to manage. And I think there's an interesting conversation about the extent to which people have this very high on the list of desirable qualities.
Well, Chris, I suppose just being devil's advocate, I mean, if you're trying to build community, then one of the great things that we've seen with a number of developments in East London is actually where the community takes ownership and does it itself.
Absolutely right.
If you have your own garden, you mow the lawn. Why can't you do that in an open? It's a great way to get outside, do a bit of exercise, and also meet your neighbours as well.
Absolutely right, and
it's these community allotments as well, aren't they? They're not just doing individual allotments. It's now community allotments for that whole community to take responsibility of, and people, if they can feel empowered to look after their own thing. I think as well, someone did raise in an interesting webinar that we're all quite it's been really quite good weather considering lockdown. Would we all feel I was a really interesting curveball that someone threw into our last one, that actually we're led to believe that living outside is great, but when you live in these rural areas, and I come from farming, they are hard work when you start living rural. So people, it does take mowing your lawn, it does take maintenance. Will people actually want that when we're talking about this in the depths of winter? The thought of a garden might fill people with dread.
But maybe that's the conversation. It's garden and green space plus hyper fast internet connectivity. And but no, you're right. I think you're coming back there, David. I do think you can do a lot of these things by just trying to capitalize on some of that community spirit that we have seen accelerated through COVID and desire for interaction locally. I guess I suppose my question is whether that demand keeps up, or that way of that slight cultural shift is maintained. I mean, the UN will tell us that actually this won't be the last pandemic, and therefore we need to gear ourselves up to that kind of thing. But is there a rush to get back to normal, such that these things are forgotten when people are trying to create workspaces or create new housing?
I think that's where you have to have a plan, don't you? And Megan, you'll have that for Tipner as well after development. So.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's definitely being equipped to answer the questions that will be asked in a year's time. This will still be very relevant to people. But then we also run the risk that we've had a lot of conversations about COVID. Will there actually be a change? I think there will be, but there'll be a lot of people, we've gone back to normal quite quickly. Will there be this big change that we're expecting, or will it actually only affect small aspects? None of us could probably detail out the changes that the pandemics have, within our history that have, brought forward. We just live with those now. We don't even think about it. So will there be things actually, we won't be able to say whether that was COVID or
a lot of it, I think, depends on the length of time that social distancing has an impact, and as to how entrenched some of these shifts might become, or otherwise. And actually, if it's not that long, people might revert quite quickly. Just sort of one thing I was also interested to pick up on, and it goes to viability. And without sort of going across other webinar topics, but I guess I'm interested in the extent to which you're sort of looking at modern methods of construction, and whether modular housing pieces can sort of start to bring the cost of development down, but actually create more space for this sort of slightly wider view of development, and whether that's something that you looked at, Megan, for Tipner, and David, you're talking to clients about at the moment.
Did you want to go first, David?
No, you go. That's right.
Okay. So yes, we are looking. Just go for it. No, we are looking at modern methods of construction. I think you'd be silly not to nowadays to look at all the options that are out there. We're also looking at that in other developments in Portsmouth. I think it's something that, yes, we will continue to look at it as long as it provides the quality that we want to be able to provide. And I think the beauty of viability is you can play around with things and understand what works and what doesn't, but it's definitely an option that's open to us.
And I think we'd take exactly the same, Chris. I think it's called modern methods of construction. I mean, we've been doing this with the likes of Berkeley Homes for years now, and certainly likes of LNG with their developments as well. I mean, great leadership. This absolutely is a way to build more efficiently, to build higher quality as well. But I think, Megan, you touched on it as well. I think really important to make sure that these homes are not just modular, and then when they come on site, they're then fixed permanently, but that they have the flexibility, so that communities, you can age in your house, you can move it around for different things, or indeed indeed, actually, you know what, I think we might come and touch on this but before the end, but actually I think COVID has actually shown there's different layouts that we might need for our homes if we were designing them now compared with traditionally as well, and so important for new methods of construction to be able to build homes like we're doing for offices, which has a maximum of permanently temporary.
Indeed, and so that you're alluding to people wanting workspaces and studies and dining rooms being repurposed.
I think just some of the things that are in WSP's mind on this are so you have your garden at the back, your kitchen is at the back. I think some of the things in our mind is if you're building community, why not have the kitchen at the front? That's quite often where you spend most of your time, and have your cars parked around the back, so you're not looking out of your front window. You can see your neighbours walking up and down the street. That's interesting, rather than just looking out across cars. And I think probably the other thing, probably lockdown has shown us that probably open plan is probably not perfect when you've got 3 people working from home and your kids on Skype.
Yeah, so who's going to be brave enough to drive the change in house types?
Well, I think that there's the challenge to those of you on the call, I suppose, who are developers, isn't it? So.
Yeah,
but that goes back absolutely to that. This lets us ask the brave questions. Fundamentally, why are we designing things as we have? What's the opportunity to do something differently? Or, as I said, just to be able to build the flexibility, so it's easy to do that rather than locking in one style for forever.
I think that's exactly right, David. I don't think it goes to having to kind of nail your colours to a mast on a particular thing, and that goes to whether that's house layout, whether that's your active travel plan, whether that's your energy arrangements, whether that's if you can kind of build in enough sort of enabling infrastructure to enable that flexibility in future, then surely that's got to be the best way to approach it, and then you can slightly react to the trends by the time you get to development and selling plots. To deliver exactly what then the customer needs and is in accordance with a plan. So if there's a way of trying to sort of and a modular is great for that, but if we can apply the same thinking to what do we need to enable at base level that gives us a few options as we move forward, does that sort of hedge a little bit or give us some protection against future? I'm still back to perspex in my house. Actually, just wall the kids in a big wall of perspex, and that'll probably do the job.
So it's in the modular design. Then are we thinking about sort of a cradle to cradle sort of approach then in terms of the design or the flexibility of the design?
I think you can call it sort of phrases that you like, but I do think the permanently temporary philosophy is a good way of thinking about that. So that's very established for commercial spaces that we design now. So places where from the walls to the electrics, that they're very much, again, if you don't mind another maxim, plug and play. So that you can shift things around very, very easily without large amounts of waste and with large amounts of expense. I think there's still great opportunity to bring that into residential developments.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, and just echo the point around flexibility. Just trying to preempt as much as we can that future piece, but it does come down to a lot of flexibility.
And I suppose probably Nicola, to the same to that point is, we're all talking about COVID now, but you know what I mean. Our future insights team in WSP, we spent a long time. There's lots of trends that we can forecast. COVID was came from utterly nowhere, and now we're all wise to it. Let's be absolutely clear that we can plan for the trends that we know, but in 2 years' time there will be something else that we don't know what we didn't know, and so that's why designing and planning flexibly is absolutely a good maxim to respond to that future uncertainty.
Absolutely right. It's I like what you're saying. You can't plan for what you don't know, but you can plan for the fact you don't know it. And it's not a futurist get out clause, of course, David.
Yeah. Absolutely not.
couldn't possibly have known. Yeah.
I don't so much have a question as a statement on the Q&A. It says people in the countryside often need cars as cycling often involves a long journey, ! And we live here to indulge our passions, like classic car collecting with large garages with offices above. Please bear that in mind when planning.
Absolutely. I come back. I think it can take a long time. I think if the rural connectivity piece on transport is a major issue, and I think it's coming back. I think perhaps away from mobility to accessibility. What do you need to access? And this goes to your customer's point at tip there, Megan. What do they need to get to? And actually, that might not involve necessarily travelling the same distances as we were used to. And so that it could be that the e-bike works in that scenario, or it could be your shop and your coffee shop is on site, and actually that's bringing down a proportion of your weekly journeys anyway. So I think for me that's absolutely right, and we need to not focus on mobility, as Megan says, about getting out and leaving. It's about accessibility. What do you need to get access to? And I do think that the COVID-19 has reversed that thinking to an extent, in that we're not thinking about we have to go somewhere, we just have to get to something. And I think that if we can sort of bring that into design and delivery of amenity is probably the key for me. And that if that philosophy permeates different developments in different areas, then hopefully we ultimately get to the right outcome.
Okay, so we're coming to the end of the webinar. I don't know if anyone's got a change of opinion, but we'll do the poll that we did in the beginning again and just see if we really feel like the trend is set to continue. The question again was, pre-COVID research expected by 2025 there to be an extra 2.5 million people in the UK city centre. Is this trend set to continue? And we'll just see who wrote down the results from the last one.
Yeah, I've slightly changed my mind actually this time.
So it's coming through. 80% think, about 80% think the answer is no. So David, do you want to summarise that from the previous question, the first one?
I think we're even more coming out of town, aren't we?
Yeah.
I think it's unsurprising. It will be really interesting to see in 2 years' time whether that's reality.
Yeah, I think it depends on the extent of which, if businesses are exiting city centres, does that mean they get replaced by urban living, or do they just not get replaced at all? And that's very hard to predict. If I were investing in PRS and flats in urban areas at the moment, that would be a significant question.
And Megan, I suppose you're quite pleased about that result.
Absolutely. Everyone needs to come out to the beautiful South Coast. No, I think it's a really, I think it's very interesting times ahead, and the opportunity for some with this is fascinating. So yes, I watch this space. How interesting.
So so from, I think it was 80%, and then so the question, the first time we asked the question, no was 64%. So yeah, quite a different change, quite a large difference. So with that in mind, I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. David, Chris, Megan, thank you very much for your time, and thank you very much for listening. And if you do have any questions, please contact me, Chris. We're happy to pass them on to Megan and David, or answer them ourselves. So thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Foot Anstey, powering your ambition.